We might start. Hello and welcome to our panel tonight. I'm Lydia Miller, your facilitator, and we have joining us, and I'll start from my left, Rolf de Heer is a filmmaker. Andrew Bovell is the writer of The Secret River. Tony Birch is an academic and a poet. And Rachael Maza is artistic director of Ilbijerri Theatre Company. What an extraordinary night in the theatre. And for those who are in the room, who has seen this production for the first time? Okay.
Whoa!
It's a good starting point. This panel tonight will look at the element of shared histories and different perspectives. The ability to tell the story of a difficult historical narrative is something within the Australian arts, whether through the literary or the filmic or the theatrical tradition, a way of reframing what our histories have been and what it is to be Australian in this day and age. A difficult history that's been shaped by colonisation. And in this question, I'm going to ask, do we really have a shared history? And what is our cultural narrative? In this particular production tonight, we have seen the shaping of a cultural narrative. And I'm going to open it with Andrew's reflections on the basis that when you are able to frame a history, the device of telling that story means that you are ultimately setting up your protagonist and your protagonist's engagement with the world around them. So in this case, I guess, Andrew, if you would like to let us have some insight into how you thought you would frame this particular narrative.
Sure, thanks, and thanks very much for your attendance at the play and the panel tonight. Look, the starting point with this work was Kate Grenville's novel, of course, which is much loved but also a controversial work. But that's where we began. And we made some very big decisions in adapting the book in order to manage the material. For instance, we lost the London story and began where we felt the most relevance was to an Australian audience, and that is where white met black and the outcome of that meeting. That became our central kind of thematic concern. But in the novel, Kate, for her own reasons that she's explained, and I won't try to explain them, but she kept the Darug characters at a distance, and that they were largely described through the point of view of the white characters, the European characters. Now, we really retained that device, except it was in the theatre, of course, we can't simply have actors of any kind in a corner being described. They must have language, they must have motive, they must have an agenda, and they must have stakes in the drama. So I thought it was very much my job to begin to create that. And we did that with the collaboration with Richard Green, a Darug actor and elder in Sydney, and the cast, of course. And the first important thing we did was to give those characters Darug names. But, and that immediately humanised them beyond their construction in the novel. But the important thing we were able to do beyond that, look, the difficulty in the adaptation always was my concern that there was no language for the Darug characters. And so we tried a number of devices where we made up languages that both the European characters and the Darug characters used and exchanged at different times. But once Richard Green came on board, he said it's a lie that there's no language. Of course there's language. And he opened his mouth and he began to sing. And as soon as he began to sing, I realised we cracked open how to approach this work. It was a very powerful moment in its development. And then it was about creating the language that was appropriate to the show. But what we retained from the novel is a story that was largely told through the point of view of Thornhill as the protagonist and the other white characters. And that is essentially a decision that was taken so that the audience were placed in those shoes. Because one of my concerns and how I feel that we've grown up with the history, with that particular history, is that those deeds were done by evil men, where in fact they were done by people not unlike us. And that was both Kate Grenville's achievement with the book, I think, and I think we've managed that with the play, was to ask the audience to empathise with a character who in the end carried out this act. And certainly it's asking the audience, would have you done the same thing? And I think under those circumstances, you know, my terrible fear, I would like to think that I would be like Dick the son or Thomas Blackwood, but my terrible fear is that I would have made the same choice as Thornhill.
In framing Thornhill as empathetic, in some respects, are we asked to empathise with Thornhill as the anti-hero in this? Australia's got many mythologies that it's created about, you know, battling the environment and forging ahead with creating a civilization. And in this, Thornhill, by the very end, it would appear, gains material wealth and loses his soul. And maybe that's a metaphor for Australia.
That's exactly the metaphor. A terrible price is paid by what was done. So when Thornhill builds his fence at the end, he's also creating the bars which imprison him. And that can be seen very much as a kind of act of the imprisonment of the soul, and it's one that we are still living with the legacy of. But clearly Thornhill is cast as a hero. He's a good man. He's a father. He wants what most of us want, which is a secure future and a way to bring up his family, to protect his family. He wants nothing more. And by casting him as a man who had nothing, as a result of the English class system and as a victim of the English class system, he comes to these shores as an heroic figure in our own mythology, but by the end of the play, that is clearly turned and he has become an oppressive figure.
I guess in some of the discussions with all of you, there's been an exploration of the idea of being able to access the Aboriginal characters in the play. And Rachael, it would be great to have your perspectives in terms of what you think that then means in terms of the way we create our cultural narratives.
It's very evident that, in fact, I first worked with Andrew many years ago on a production called Holy Day, which in a similar way is a unapologetic investigation of the kind of deep psyche of, that first wave of white Australia. Set in the frontier days, and which I think was my first experience of a play that unapologetically went into that dark place. And watching again tonight, I was very aware that once again, and I admit I've not read Kate's book, but that quite evidently there is this, how do we tell our stories unapologetically from your perspective as a white, as the white dominant culture. And actually I think that's such a kind of exciting and fantastic way for us to be going as a nation as we grapple our way forward to tell our stories. That said, when I first saw the show in Sydney, I felt very excluded from that story as an Indigenous person, and kind of walking out of there for ages afterwards, thinking, what is it? What's this feeling? And I couldn't quite put it into words. And it was definitely this kind of like, I've walked out of a story that's not mine. And it's not pretending to be. Even though the narrator character is a black woman, she speaks the voice of the writer. It was obviously Kate Grenville's voice, And you know, even tonight I was thinking, I wonder why you would have a black woman speaking the white voice. Anyway, I understand the grappling with, you know, I was imagining myself in the room trying to grapple with how would I tell this story. And once again, I think it's, I really want to acknowledge and celebrate that we are grappling with these stories and that we may not always get them right. And that certainly this may not be the story that I would tell. In fact, I definitely would not tell this story. I realised that this is a story, as Andrew, you said, of the hero. This every man who started out with nothing, and everyone in the audience can totally what goes on this ride through his eyes. You absolutely are 100% empathetic with Thornhill and his journey, and that is how the play is written. That's the vehicle that we all agree to go on. It's very clear right from the onset, throughout the journey, that we're going to go on this journey with Thornhill. And he is the hero, and the people that resemble me are the losers. They all die out, and that is definitely not the story I want to be telling my kids. Where's Delia? Exactly. So yeah, what was interesting is how we tell our narratives, and I think we all have a responsibility to tell our narratives from our perspective. I absolutely acknowledge that. I suppose what we have to acknowledge, though, is that there is a long history of imbalance of who's been telling their story, and the dominant culture has dominated that space for an awful long time, and I'm really interested in telling the story of our heroes.
I'd like to just bring it back to Andrew about how would you have created access by use of creating subtitles for the language? Because I guess the conceptual domain that's being created for the audience is that victor vanquished. And in that respect, if there were subtitles, I know because when I read the script, I saw the English translation and I thought, this is quite funny in terms of the dynamics of that group. And in the theatrical rendition, that wasn't, I didn't have that in. So I just was curious about that.
Yeah, it's one of the most debated aspects of the show. We tried subtitles on both both versions of the play, and we had very serious discussions around what it meant to have them and what it meant not to. There's a lovely lot of detail going on in that family group. They are talking about much the same sort of subjects as the white family are talking about. What's for dinner tonight? Who are those other people on the other side of the point? And when the hell are they going to go? But it was a decision that the cast made, that particularly the Indigenous cast made. Richard Green spoke very passionately that he wanted the Darug language to speak for itself, and the actors also felt that they wished to convey the meaning of the scenes and the meaning of their story through their physicality, and they wanted to allow the language to be heard undistracted by the need to translate. So our belief and our hope was that, firstly, it was an assertion of the fact that language has survived, not only survived but flourished. And I contest Rachael's point that the show suggests in any way that Aboriginal culture has ended or been destroyed. Very clearly in the play, and a lot of what Diribin says, the character of the narrator, is actually my own words, not Kate's. I very deliberately made both Kate's voice and my own work alongside each other. And there's a very particular reference in that final monologue, which Rachael will know from Holy Day, because a very similar device was used, which is the narrator says, somebody else survived that day, I survived and I witnessed it, and I know what happened, and I will tell this story. I think Ningali dropped a line today which is a reference to her... Sorry, Ning, if I've put you in the bad books there.
Busted.
But there is a reference to her child, which is very important. She takes her child and takes him with her. That's a very important and conscious gesture on my behalf to say there is a witness to this, that there is an oral history around it that was deliberately silenced for generations in this country and is now, since in the last 20 or so years, being told both by Indigenous storytellers and white storytellers.
The subtlety, I guess, of introducing what they call linguistic relativity is that the story gets told in English, and English becomes a lingua franca for understanding. And I just want to look at this from Rolf's perspective, because I know in your various films, and notably with Gulpable, that you've explored language, especially in 10 Canoes, which is entirely in language, and you subtitled that. But in our discussions, Rolf said there's an accidental trilogy, or perhaps I called it the trilogy, the accidental trilogy, which is the beauty of seeing 10 Canoes pre-contact, Tracker, Contact, and then Charlie's Country, which is a reality.
Consequences of Contact.
Consequences of Contact, yes. It'd be great for you, some of your reflections about that.
Oh, look, it's when I just think it's such a difficult thing to deal with, and what. Okay, I'm just going to go in another area first.
Yes, go for it.
Which is when I was asked to do this, I thought, okay, well, good thing, and I'll read the book, and enjoy that. And I read the book, and I didn't enjoy it at all, because it felt to me like an apology for why white people massacred Aboriginal people. And I don't agree with what was said, which is that, here are good people who do this. Okay, the good people didn't do it. There were many people who objected enormously. And, it's not so... Now, that said, when I had read the book, I thought, what are they going to do with the play? And so I was very keen when I saw it tonight. And the framing is completely different than the book. I mean, it's like a history of the grappling that we're doing, because it starts with Aboriginal people, okay? And it says, here we are, we're the first, okay? And we were here first, and this is our story too, in a way. And I understand why you have an Indigenous woman being the narrator, choosing to have a narrator. To do that, you're having somebody who bears witness. And I did think I couldn't recall that character in any way spoke like that in the book during the massacre. And I thought, that must be Andrew, and it was. That's good to hear. When first I grappled with this, it was a story that I was commissioned to write a story that was a white cabin boy who got washed over during a storm into a pre-contact situation on northern Queensland coast, and it was his story of what happened to him. And then eventually, white people came and massacred people and things like that. Now, my grappling with that was about language, because language is what identifies, and I thought, well, this is a big film. If people don't speak English, it'll never get financed. It's as simple as that. And I thought, well, if we subtitle the Aboriginal people and the English people speak English, and the cabin boy speaks English and so on, that's felt wrong and unfair. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll get the Aboriginal people to speak English, and I'll make up a gobbledygook tongue for him that at least we can see the inside. So these were grapplings, and that's how difficult it is. It is truly difficult when you tangle with this material. Now, The Tracker was the film I made first out of those three, and it has little bits of language in it only, and it was not meant to be specifically an Aboriginal story. It was as much a white person's story, although David, I think, shifted it to being what it was, which was more of an Aboriginal story than it started off being. And when that was made, and there were other films made at that time, and it was all glorious and terrific, and then everything stopped. And then it was a question of, okay, well, what would one do next? And that was then to make a film in language. But even that was compromised, because we did a version where David's narration was also in language, and that was subtitled. And it didn't work nearly as well as the version of David speaking in English and the character speaking in language and being subtitled. And for reasons of you, who are the audience, in the end we thought, okay, well, let's do that version, because it's a big step along the way, and probably more people will see it, and I think that was the case. Now, Charlie's Country was easy. It was simply people spoke their own language whenever they spoke whatever they did, and it so happened that more of it was set in language-speaking area than in English-speaking area, and so it was a relatively straightforward exercise. But I do appreciate with this the difficulties that lay. I think that the play has done a lot to undo the heroic aspect of. It seemed to me that the book, it was probably not intended to be, but it felt like an apology for why good people do this. I think the play has undone a lot of that by equalising participation a great deal, and I thought that was a fantastic thing. It's one of the things I really liked about the play.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Tony, in respect to constructing the hero myths that really start to enable us to share a history, what do you think are some of the considerations that come into that in terms of giving Aboriginal people agency within these narratives?
Well, a bit like Rolf, I've read the book and actually done a couple of public conversations with Kate, and it was remarkable to see those differences in the play. So what I felt was, for me, most effective in the play was some real subtle moments, so that when you have this sort of absurd choir of the settlers, and then this wonderful sort of movement around in song, I thought that was really effective. And those sort of moments which are less dramatic or even melodramatic, I think that's where that comes to the fore of really giving voice. So I think that is effective. I think, for me, there is a real problem, not with the play. It's interesting that I get on really well with Kate. We had really good conversations, and people have heard about the controversy. And in defence of Kate Grenville as a writer, I think a lot of the attacks on Grenville were from the professional history trade, which are, they're more closed than the Masons, the history profession. And they don't like people standing on their turf. So I was very defensive. And I've got a PhD in history, but I was very defensive of Kate there. One of Kate's defences as a fallback, and I think in some ways not the best fallback position, was to fall back, well, it's just fiction. Now, the issue there is that the book was being taught at Vyse, and it's a very influential book at that level. So I hosted sessions at the VCE. My daughter was studying the book at VCE, and some kids take it away as that's their history, or that's the only history they've had of this horrific period. So they take it as very serious, and they take a lot from it. So I think that is an issue, because with the play as well, when I was watching it, I actually think it's a remarkable piece of theatre. Some of what was translated to the stage and done better, I was in awe of, and I think, walking away from it, if someone says, what's this like as a piece of theatre, it's great. But then the question has to come up, well, again, is it a fiction? And yes, it is a fiction. And I think, therefore, again, when you think about the impact, because the reviews have been wonderful reviews, and justly so, is that I do have a fundamental problem then with the play, in that the three male characters, so Thornhill, Smasher Sullivan in particular, and Blackwood, is that they're presented in the play, in my view, as archetypes, and quite segmented different archetypes. So Blackwood is, in a sense, the reconciliation character, or through whatever means he's found cohabitation. And by the way, I would not for a minute say that these histories aren't real, because we know they are. So where there are relationships between white men and Aboriginal women, in some instances which are consensual, we know that historically, although we would know that that is an absolute, it's atypical in that sense, because Aboriginal women suffered such violence. And then we have Thornhill, who's already been discussed enough, I think, and very accurately so. My real issue here is that it's the character of Smasher. Now, and Rolf and Andrew disagree a little bit about what good people do, but the real crux for me is that Thornhill is driven to a homicidal act, partly because in the end the desperation to keep his wife, partly in the desperation to keep a home, but in fact he's driven by a homicidal person in the guise of Smasher. So that he represents, and very macabre but wonderfully presented end of the shooting. It's quite horrific and really upsetting when they're coming forward with the guns. It works very effectively at theatre. What I would say, and I'm here falling back as an Aboriginal researcher, most Aboriginal people who were killed in southeastern Australia were not killed by rogue homicidal maniacs. Most Aboriginal people were killed in preemptive, conscious raiding parties that not only were given the auspice of the state, which were defended by the state. So my sense is that in the part of the country we're talking about, you are talking about state-sanctioned and state-orchestrated violence. And in an evidence-based situation, you can find that ad nauseum. So you can look at settlers' diaries, chief protectors' diaries, magistrates' diaries. So in the work that I did in the 19th century, around the same time in Western Victoria, after an Aboriginal boy is thrown on a fire and roasted by a group of men who now have a seat in Parliament named after them, the Henty brothers, the police magistrate in Portland says they are killing them and I hope they kill them. He tells the chief protector that. So you have one government official informing another government official that there is a widespread massacre of Aboriginal people and he hopes the massacre continues. So there's no sense in this that it's going to be stopped. And at the moment I'm rereading the original newspaper articles of the Coniston massacre, which in some ways again is presented as the violence of a rogue policeman. We know this has been represented historically in theatre as well. If you read the newspaper reports, in fact, while we might have a supposedly sort of homicidal and quite violent man carrying out the murders or leading the party, the support given by the media is absolute. The support given by the legal system is absolute. And you have these fabrications, which is quite interesting, that lovely little take where Smasher starts to talk it up into this history and retells the story and it gets more dramatic, where in newspaper tales you start to get fictions about women being taken to justify the massacre that occurred. So my discomfort, in the sense, is that if you take it away thinking that Thornhill is driven to violence in a way, he's really led by this wonderfully played character, by the way. I mean, he's incredibly evil. Is that works well for me as a fiction, and it's a great piece of drama, but I wouldn't want people to see that as representative, because it is not representative. And we might say, well, it doesn't have to be, and I agree with that as well, except that's what happens. People walk away and it becomes their history. Now, that's not Andrew's responsibility or the actors or anyone's, but it's why we need more varied theatre. And to back up Rachel's point, and we talked about this today, it's why we need, and I'm sure that Andrew and Rolf would agree with this, we need a wide array of tellings, so that then as audiences we can say, okay, there are various interpretations and manifestations, and then with all that at hand, you can make a more informed decision about the past. So it's not anyone's responsibility who's put on this great bit of theatre to say, well, I can't do everything, because I can't. But we need more voices, we need more Aboriginal voices, telling a range of stories that then give people that richness that we don't have, I don't think we have enough of.
Mm. I guess in this regard, we've had an extraordinary insight into the Australian psyche. I think when I was talking to Andrew, I said perhaps the Australian genre is Gothic horror, in light of Holy Days, but also in light of that insight into Secret River. You've examined the brutalisation of class from England. You've examined the rise of the squattocracy, the trade in body parts that did factually occur in the early days of the colony. I guess I'm going to put to all of you, what are the stories we should be telling now? We tell the stories of our history with the observance of today, because we stand in part in judgment. But if we were to tell the stories of today in light of the fact that the state itself has sanctioned the intervention, the placement of people on managed welfare cards, we've got the highest incarceration rates in juvenile justice. We have the highest number of children being removed from their families. We have the absolute diminution of people talking their languages, and the privileging and primacy of English as being the predominant way that people feel that Aboriginal people can come into the 21st century. So I'm going to put to you, if that's what is occurring in the world around us today, what are the stories we should be telling? Or what would you like to be telling?
I asked Rachael, we're going to ask everyone in the audience, but you mean us?
Yeah, I'm in the panel, because we'll open it out to the audience. Yeah.
I'll just say two quick things. People know, or people who know me, a lot of my... I'm actually working on climate change now, but prior to that, it's not funny. Prior to that, one of the things I did was look at Aboriginal women's writing, and it was my sort of closest to my heart, and my concern for probably more than a decade is to go to the Public Record Office and read the very poignant letters of Aboriginal women demanding their children be returned, demanding that they have a decent roof over their head. Women who did that at the threat of having their children taken, which of course they were, of being put out in the street, of losing their family and community. So one of the things that I think is that Aboriginal women are the most abused people in Australian history, a group of people. I'm concerned about human right for all women, but when we consider what's happened to Aboriginal women and their incredible resilience, I think that's firstly one of the stories that absolutely needs to be told. And the second one is, because of my climate change work, part of it is to work with teenagers, and I work with teenagers about how we talk about climate change to kids, and how do we get kids to respond with creative responses. And what I found in doing it, probably not surprising, this is a global project I'm involved in, is that we need to tell more stories about young people, not as dickheads and menaces and social media addicts, of people who are more concerned about some of these issues than we are, and are demanding of us that we take responsibility. So those two, they're on my mind at the moment. I'd love to see more focus on those two aspects of both history and contemporary society.
Mm-hmm. And Rachael? Rachael, I know that Jack Charles versus the Crown was a story of institutionalisation of Jack Charles. And that's had enormous success. But what do you think as well are the next stories we should be telling?
Well, going back to my original comment, it's the stories that I guess what gets me up out of bed, and what I want my son to be seeing is, once again, the stories of our heroes, and the everyday heroes, I suppose. Whether it's the women who were extraordinarily strategic and mastering this language, this second language, and very quickly learning the etiquettes of how to address the authorities, so to be able to get what they needed, which may have been permission to go and visit there or take their son to hospital. This extraordinary capacity of Aboriginal people under extraordinary circumstances to be able to find such sophisticated ways of surviving and adapting to this world that very fastly was so devastating, the impact on our people. And that for me is working with people like Uncle Jack, who's an extraordinary survivor. Is always such a kind of little word, but much more than that. He's a thriver. He's an incredible inspiration and role model. And you know, actually, that said, just Andrew, my experience of working with you on Holy Day, I really, really value how important it is for us to look at our history, to tell those stories of our history, but and in that, how they inform us today. And I love that quote I read not long ago, history is not the stories, history is not what happened in the past, it's the stories we tell about the past. That realisation that history is how we talk about, is the stories that we're telling right here and now. So so the history is great as long as it doesn't, as long as it's not like this is what's happened back then. So I'm very interested in, and I think, you know, Andrew, you do that very successfully, you know, with those, that certainly Holy Day tapped right into, and Secret River, you're tapping right into that psyche that lives within our DNA as a nation, I think is really powerful theatre. So certainly, but yeah, there's ultimately the stories the stories that I want my kids to see is the stories that I want to tell. The stories that are going to inspire him to get up and to excel and to be a leader in this country, to be proud of who he is, and yeah.
Fabulous, Andrew.
I take up the points of how important diversity is, that there is a very broad range of storytellers in this country, and in order to allow diversity of storytelling, sometimes if you're white and male in this country, it means stepping back and not occupying the space. And I deliberately did that after Holy Day. I stepped back from this content until Secret River. But I still think there is a great tension between black and white in this country. And it's not a tension that I want to live with or that I want my children to live with. And as all I can do as a writer is try and unpick its reasons and its causes. So I remain fascinated by colonisation and its legacy on black and white in this country. And I remain committed to the task of peeling away layers of mythologies that have been constructed in order to hide that history. I'm passionate about that, but I can only actually do that in collaboration with Indigenous people and with their licence and their permission, not to tell their story, but actually for them to lead us back so that we can tell our story. I guess is one of the ways I look at it. But can I also say that I'm really conscious of a whole generation of really interesting Indigenous playwrights in my own field. Giada Albert, Leah Purcell, Nikaya Louis, Kylie Coolwell, who are at this stage telling stories largely about the contemporary Indigenous experience, which in its own way bears out the legacy of colonisation. I'm very excited about what that generation of playwrights are doing. They're strong, they carry their culture very consciously, and they're very political, and they're telling great stories, and I'm excited about where that's going to go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about Andrew's point, which is so important. I taught at Melbourne University for about 15 years until last year, and the question would always come up every semester, usually by a young white student who was in socialist action, but it was, you know, of course, white people should stop telling Aboriginal stories, or white people should stop writing Aboriginal characters. And my response has always been the same, and to hear Andrew is to, I suppose in a way, wonderful support for what I thought, because I always said to those people, that is not the question. That is not what should be on our minds. What should be on our minds is how do we find ways to get more Aboriginal voices, more Aboriginal writers, actors, producers in the creative arts into the public realm, so that when you can see these ensemble of works together, you can make a wonderful judgment of how we all see this. And the notion that you would ask people to simply step aside and not think about these issues is to, in a way, well, to me, listening to Andrew, it's to deny someone what to them is a sense of how do they respond to what they see as an ethical and moral issue if they're a creative person, and to suggest or think that you would stifle that creativity, I think, is an anathema to what we want to do as a society. It's just as Andrew said, we get people out there producing stuff, and if we want to say, well, this playwright did a poor job, we can judge it along something that we consider maybe better. So I think it's such a wonderful thing to hear.
Rolf, what are the stories that you want to tell from now on?
Look, I despair, really. I had similar questions about all this as Andrew, and I stepped back and because I thought, no, it's wrong. It's wrong for me to do this. It's wrong for me to have ideas in this area so deep. And until the tracker came along, and that was something I felt I could tell, because it was as much my story as it was anybody else's story. But after that, it's only been because I'm asked. I'm invited in. Please, will you do this with us? Please. But look at the diversity. The Australia Council, the Australian Film Commission years ago worked hard in film to shift the balance to bring Indigenous storytellers to the fore, but still there are communities like the ones that I've tended to be with where English is barely spoken, and the idea of them making a film themselves is a million miles away. And I guess that's where I can do a bit sometimes, but I despair because it's getting worse. All the measurements are getting worse, and even though we make these efforts, it feels worse than climate change. That all the culture will disappear, even though people are trying to hold on to it in some small way, and it's sorry.
No, I don't think it's sorry. I think it's if our storytellers enable us to be cathartic about an unresolved history, then that is a starting point to actually have a national conversation where it is legitimised and it's valid, and it's not something that is low on the ladder of where our societal priorities are. It's not always the economy. I want to... it's always about the human experience. I'm going to open this up for questions from you all, because I think we've got 4 fantastic creative people who have got fantastic minds, and it's your opportunity to engage. Kelton, you wanted to say something? Is there a roving mic? Thanks.
Cheers. I'm representing the cast of this play. I said years ago that I wasn't going to do theatre what was written by white people about Aboriginal people. But I said to Kate, I said, Andrew, who directed it? Neil. I said, Neil cast me for a reason, because it's about time we got this play right. Okay? And I've got friends who criticise this, with good purpose. But two people which are missing from, two most important things that are missing from this production, from this important writing, is that Blackwood, There was 150 Blackwoods out on that river, married to Aboriginal people. They'd been through Aboriginal law. That was one bridge that was burnt by the whitefellas. They went out and killed the Blackwoods, the blackfellas and the Blackwoods in that camp. And that little boy Dick left his father, Wiseman's fairy, and he killed his wife. He pushed her down the stairs. So a lot of things are missing, but I didn't want to watch the film. I hadn't seen the play when it came to Perth. I'm someone who just feels that I needed to do it. Plus my missus said we need money.
Yeah.
But most importantly, this is so extremely hurtful for us as these blackfellas. We're taking on these characters. And I've made sure that every one of us in this cast are a family. And it is very important that if whitefellas do write things, and brothers and sisters, unless they're going to write a story about another country, they have to involve us. And there has to be people like myself and yourself to represent us the proper way. Now, I've just come off stage and I need a drink, so thank you very much.
That's probably a perfect segue into you being able to ask questions. Shared histories, different perspectives. Part of that is the exploration of our storytelling. I'm going to open it up to the floor.
Good evening. My name is Pauline Wyman. Great performance tonight by all the actors. Thank you, Kelton, and all the brothers and sisters and the rest of the cast and crew. It's great to have this panel here tonight. I'm a Yorta Kulin Nation woman, and I just wanted to try and articulate some of my feelings. I've been an actress here in the country and from this area for a good part of 20 years, and I've often struggled with having to work or find work is one thing. We all need to work, we've got to pay bills, so often as an actor we're brought into the fold during development where our brains are picked to pieces. I mean, we've heard this story before numerous times, and David Goldwell is probably, probably well known for his contribution to some of the greatest films in this country. He's one of the many fine actors overall in this country, and he's often worked with Rolf to Heer. What I guess I'm trying to say is, listening to you guys tonight, to talk about, you sort of touched on it already, in regards to funding, and if we were to speak our own language then we may not get funded. There really needs to be a reframing of the people in the gateholder positions that trickle down the funds. And I think as Aboriginal people, we need to be our own agencies for our own voice. And I understand, it's 2016, we live here together sharing this land. That's what makes it all the more difficult. But we need to be listened to, and I feel that, as Rachael said as well, and Tony beautifully articulated as well, we really need to be able to be our own agency. We are 3% of the overall population, and we need to tell stories that represent ourselves in this community of Australia, from all our diversities as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think I'm going around in circles right now, but what I really wanted to say is that we need to, the people who have the opportunity to fund us, they get often the gatekeepers to the stories in this country, and there's no lack of willing and able writers and directors and actors and producers, and some people in the room here today, Glenn Shea, Jacob Bohm, Benny Gratz, some wonderful actresses. But there's many, many more. I don't know if I've made any sense there, but anyway.
No, you have. I think
we
you're
love
talking
you,
about
Pauline.
creative control, and I know Rachael has been a great champion for creative control within the creative process. Do you want to kind of reflect on that and what that means?
Yeah, and just jumping on what you're saying, Pauline, like having been an actor myself for, nearly 100 years, there's been such a kind of long history and experience that we all share of coming in at the 11th hour and usually, well, often, obviously, it's written by white fellas, and the parts are poorly written, and your character is generally the loser in the story. The stereotypes of your people, the characters are often two-dimensional, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's such a long way from what we've experienced tonight. I'm certainly not saying that's what Secret River has been, but there's a long history, and I hear you, Pauline. We're coming to a time where more critical than ever, as we move forward as a nation, that the Indigenous voice needs to be having authority in that conversation. That defines us as we now start to talk together. We have such a long history of those stories where we basically we've been sitting within the stereo, I learnt this term the other day, the tropes. So the way that we will be represented, have been represented, will continue to be perpetuated. The mythologies about Indigenous people will continue to be perpetuated. The tropes like that, the fact that we all died out, and that those of us that are still here are not real Aboriginals, those sorts of theories. One that we were, and this is going right back to Aristotle and all that mob, that we were that other class of people that really aren't people. And what I hear in the American Constitution the other day, that black people are 3/5 human. And it's in their constitution. And so this actually was this dude talking on the radio about his book, The American... Yeah, probably. Exactly. So it's in the DNA of Western civilization, this kind of subculture of Indigenous people, and these continue to get perpetuated in our stories. Like I think to the generation before me, my father and Zach Martin and all the actors and Arnie Juzzy, the roles that people have had to playing these kind of lower class, sort of lesser than people with unemployed, drugs, they all die or get raped, or it's so time. We are so long past that. There is an extraordinary population of the most extraordinary, highly educated, highly sophisticated black people in this country. Strong leaders in all areas, but we don't see them in our stories. So we're long overdue for starting to celebrate those stories. And we need to have authority over those stories, otherwise the other stories are going to keep getting told, the ones that actually aren't true.
It was interesting because while you were talking, Pauline, and just listening to Rachael, there are two really, I think, major associated issues that Pauline has raised, and that is whether it be to do with funding or being able to deliver, is that we are still regarded as suspect. In other words, will they really deliver? Will they actually be able to, in the end, produce the goods? And people who think that's a sort of paranoia on the part of Aboriginal people, it's relative suddenly to what Rachael ended with about sophisticated, intelligent, educated. Okay, I've got a PhD. Garry Foley, who has the office next to me, is a professor, as he'll tell you every time you see him. When I started at Victoria University last year, Foley and I were asked to host a student night of awards for Victoria University, where students were getting major awards from business. And before I was about to get up on stage, and by the way, that university saw me as someone they would poach from the University of Melbourne, and Garry Foley had just been promoted. Before I got up on stage, a very senior person at the university said to me, I really need you boys to behave because there are industry people here. And then I said to Foley, you know, she's shitting herself. So we got up knowing that there were wonderful students in that audience, you know, mothers who'd gone back to university, who'd had 5 kids and done it on their own, young disabled people, refugees who'd been in the country for 2 years, as if we wouldn't deliver something professionally for those people. And then when we finished and got down from the stage, she said, that was amazing. Now, it wasn't amazing. It was just doing your job and being professional. Her anxiety the whole time was, can these boys deliver? So that's the first point about being suspect. The other point, and again, it's not a criticism of Secret River, but I talked to Kate Grenville about this, and I know this because I was involved many years ago in the so-called History Wars debate with people like Keith Windschuttle. What was interesting, if a left-wing white historian or liberal-minded historian or an apologist white person got up and talked about violence against Aboriginal people, they were taken on as a hero by the largely white audience. If an Aboriginal person had said exactly the same words, or when we got up and said, this happened to our people, this is what we have in our whole history, again, we were regarded as entirely suspect. Whether we had a university education, whether we really revered elders in our community. So white liberal Australia still prefers to get its understanding of what happened to Aboriginal people from white people. And people here might feel a bit uncomfortable about that, but my whole experience of being in this arena is that any position adopted by an Aboriginal person, which is to tell our truth, and to tell those truths in that way, is not only suspect, there's something questionable, highly questionable about it. And if people don't think that's true, go back, look at the media that came out after the Bringing Them Home report in 1997 and ask why were so many people in the liberal media questioning the validity of the Bring Them Home report because it didn't have Royal Commission status, and therefore the voices of the Aboriginal women who talked about their children being removed were not put under the legal scrutiny had they been, if it was a Royal Commission. In other words, a suggestion that these women's testimony had to be suspect, and that wasn't coming out of an Andrew Bolt, that was coming out of the Fairfax Press.
So tonight we're redefining the colonial narrative by reframing. Any other questions?
Thanks, panel, and for a fabulous evening.
There is the microphone.
Thanks, panel, and a terrific piece of theatre tonight. I'm interested, I've found the relationship between the children particularly fascinating and charming, and one of the things that created a lot of hope. And I'm really interested to know from a technical aspect perhaps how you have managed the very challenging material with those children actors.
I should answer that.
Yes.
We've been very mindful that we have children in the room from the beginning. There's a set of protocols when you work with children. They have chaperones. Pardon? Yeah, exactly. Kelton. So what the cast very consciously do is set out to become a family, and in that to take very good care of the children. It's been amazing watching those kids, the white children, their eyes going, whoa, opening to this story and to this history that clearly at that age they're not carrying. Similarly, to watch this play with an entire school audience is a very moving thing because I can kind of compare it to the history I was given. And it's very different, and to see them how responsive they are, and to know that this is the history and the story they're going to take forward fills me with some degree of hope. But so the children, there's a set of rules about how you work with kids, but given the material, there is a set of sensitivities about how these children, like even saying the C word in the presence of kids needs to be thought. And we have to really think, do we need that word? Do these kids need to deal with this word? So even that is talked about with them and their parents and their chaperones. Does that kind of answer your question? And you're right, the children are in this show. We could have done a show without kids. It would have been a lot easier, it would have been a lot cheaper. But clearly they stand for the future. And to see young Dick Thornhill find and Narrabee find that connection is one of the most meaningful and hopeful things in the play. But one of the most powerful things for me is when there is the fight over the corn. Garraway's arm is broken, and that look back he does to Dick, which is things are never going to be the same between us. They can never be the same. Chokes me up every time because Tony kind of talked about the Blackwood and the Smasher dichotomy, and very deliberately I am working with archetypes there in order to present Thornhill, the protagonist, with as stark a choice as possible. You can take that, because in reality we're all quite complex human beings with good and bad, but in the drama I wanted to present Thornhill with a stark choice. You can take that road and that road. And I don't entirely agree with Tony that the responsibility lies with Smasher. I think Thornhill made a very deliberate choice to follow Smasher's way and not to follow Blackwood's because of greed. He wanted that land, and in the end nothing was going to stop him.
Great. We'll take one more question.
Hello, my name's Monica. I'm a Gunai and Gunditjmara descendant, and I'm also an actor. One thing that I'm just wanting to follow on from what Rachael said was about the importance of young people, so I'm speaking of myself, passing on these stories. The last scene of Secret River, the play that we just watched, was of Trevor Jamison's character mourning for his land, mourning for his country, and still having to justify his place of belonging by him saying, "This is mine, this is me, this is my place." And I guess what I want to ask is why? Why was that the last scene? I think it's very important to, in the state of the nation as it is today, where so many young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are very lost and also searching for their identity and their sense of belonging and place to where they are today and to where their country, where their ancestral roots are. Why did that have to be the last scene? I question it because it feels like another subtle reminder that we still as Aboriginal people should feel misplaced, should feel dispossessed in some way. And I guess, it's hard for me to say this as, as someone of Aboriginal descent and as someone who is an actor and an artist as well. But I just want to know why creatively you chose that last scene, because for me it felt painful in a sense that it had to be that. Again, the Aboriginal character overstood by a white character saying, "This is mine, whether it was yours or not, it is still mine. Question your place, question your belonging," until here we are today, where we, from the brutalities of the massacres of colonisation, are still questioning our sense of belonging, our sense of place in this nation. And I just want to ask why creatively you chose that to be the last scene.
Thanks for the question. I take the way you've read that ending very seriously and take that on board. So when I first wrote the play, the end was a contemporary group of characters came on stage, sat around the fire, somebody picked up a guitar, they were chatting in English, Trevor starts playing a song and they all start singing, and it's a very strong statement of we are still here. We discussed that as a cast, and Neil and Stephen Page, and we felt that that did not honour the massacre. That we needed to actually, that it sort of so quickly moved the audience beyond the emotion of what had just happened and said, oh, it's okay, everyone survived. And very quickly we forgot that. So we made the creative decision to keep the audience in that deep psychic wound that the story takes us to, so that we can feel that very strongly. And Yalla Mullem's final lines, for me, isn't, I read it differently to you, though I take how you've read it. For me, it's an assertion of ownership, which we for so long has denied, like Thornhill. So when he says, this is me, this is my place, and he stamps his hand on the ground, he's very much saying, no matter what you've done, no matter what has happened, it changes nothing. We are here and we belong to this land. And so for me, it was a very politically strong statement to end the play with.
It's meant to make me hurt more than it's meant to make you hurt. And I think it does in a way, although I can't speak for your pain. But I think that's why it's there, so that I do feel that pain now, you know, and never forget that pain. Because if I do, then I become him, you know.
And there is a historical reference point that, and again, I take the point. I was interested when he refused. He's offered the old coat, and he refuses it. People will know that Dermot, a Wurundjeri man, he was in a very desperate situation toward the end of his life, and he was literally offered a handout by a white fella in the city. He was offered a handout, and he said, "There's nothing you can give me because all of this is mine." And when I just watching it, then that refusal of the coat to me was this is my country, and anything you can offer me will never replace that. So you probably need to contextualise it with, you know, again, maybe other discussions, but I did see it as a strong statement in some ways.
I felt that it was strong in one sense, but I did feel it was loaded in another sense with the dynamics of the characters. You know, sitting on the ground and standing up. It was, for me personally, it did feel loaded in a way. Just to end, you know, I guess end with the pain and with the assertion of we need to tell the white audience, we need to assert that the white audience feel a certain way. But would it be more beneficial to kind of go with that context, to kind of develop that more, to open that up of how we claim today, how we claim this sense of belonging? And I think it's really important in relation to today, in relation to today of where Aboriginal people sit and where we are placed in this nation as individual people, as individual communities. I think that our sense of belonging and our sense of place needs to be owned in stories a lot more, if that makes sense.
I think we've spoken how the great need for stories that we tell from now on is about the ability to present much diversity. And in that diversity are new myths that we create for our own nation, which give people agency, legitimacy and empowerment, and reflect the complexity as the archetypes we build for the future. And in that is to look at the past and say we know now for the future that the decision makers and the leaders are looking very different to the tropes that have formed part of a colonial narrative. I'm going to bring this to a close, and in doing so, I'm going to ask each of our panellists for a parting gift, and then you can join us in the bar for a drink, I guess. Rolf, I'll start with you, and we'll work down the line.
I have no parting gift to give. I have none.
In the spirit of generosity, just tell us something about the story.
About story.
Yep. The power of story.
The power of story. I'm often asked when people see, okay, in the last instance it was Charlie's Country, and when people saw Charlie's Country and a lot of Q&As, and people would ask, well, what can I do? What can we do? And I sort of say, well, you're sort of doing it because you're thinking about that question, and I think that, yeah, it's a question we need to think about a great deal more, but we mustn't come to any conclusions because it's not us who have to make the decisions. We have to allow the people who we're talking about to make the decisions.
Great. Thank you. Andrew.
A parting gift. Look, I tread very carefully through this ground and with great respect of Indigenous culture in this country. I feel that it enriches us as a whole. I feel like it should be at the centre of the way we define ourselves and the way we present ourselves to the rest of the world. I grew up in the south of Western Australia, not far from a town called Pinjarra, where perhaps 4 generations after a massacre took place there, we, as a group of kids who used to play football together, were still trying to work out the legacy of that, something we didn't understand. So it is important to me that we all find ways to shed light on that past in order to understand the present. I'm also mindful that I would very much like to take this play to London because I feel for so long we have been asked to engage with English history, and in so many ways it's defined who we see us, how white Australia sees itself. I would really like to take this play back and in a gentle way, or perhaps in an angry way, say, look what your political and economic decisions, look at the consequences of them, because you have not engaged with this history. You have abdicated your own responsibility, not in their art, not in their commentary, hardly in their history. Have they looked at the consequences of transportation and white occupation of this country? I think it's a really interesting dialogue to have with that country, and I hope that we can do that with Secret River.
Just 2 quick things. I think Andrew should take the play to London. I think he should take me with him. Lydia said I'm a poet. I'm actually a minor poet. I'm actually a novelist, so I can write any great copy that you want. But the second point, and it's just an anecdote to make my point. I was at the Adelaide Writers' Festival last week, and I had lunch with an Aboriginal mate of mine, Jared Thomas, and he talked about being on the panel because he loved the play, and he said, he mentioned Andrew. He said Andrew might be a bit anxious. He said, he might get sort of hammered or something. And I thought, well, I don't know who by, because I just want to make the point that there are issues of discussion and complexity about the play, which are the very issues we should discuss. So my commentary on the play is offered in the spirit that I think it's a wonderful vehicle for that discussion. And my critique is, I hope, a constructive and energetic critique, and that's exactly what a play like this should do. So I just want to make that clear, that I'm not thinking that the play in a negative sense. I'm thinking of what it allows us to discuss and open up, and I think tonight's been clear evidence of that. So I want to thank Andrew, and I certainly want to thank this theatre for putting the production on.
Rachael.
I absolutely agree with that. For me, the most exciting thing is that we are taking on the hard conversations as a nation. I have nothing, incredible respect for the people on this panel who, as we kind of exactly grapple with this kind of really complex and it's a long, entrenched history, and it's in the DNA. Like it's not gonna change overnight. And I really applaud those who are prepared to take these complex big steps into this complex territory. I agree absolutely that I want to make work that stirs the conversation as we move forward toward a country that celebrates its Indigenous culture and its history as a fundamental part of how you identify as an Australian. So the country that actually celebrates that rather than the country we live in at the moment. This is something that enriches to embrace this history with all its warts and all. It means going into the kind of murky territory as well, busting the boil, so to speak. But we have to go there. There's only one way forward, and it's through the boils. And ultimately, it's about empowering us all.
Tonight, you've heard 4 very special people who are valued across the arts and culture in our country. We've looked at The Secret River. You have been an audience that have, by your own emotional responses, created a wonderful living dynamic in the theatre tonight. This is about our shared histories, our different perspectives, the power of our stories, the dynamism of our storytellers, and it's also about the conversations you will have with your colleagues and your family and your community about elements of our society that you think are important conversations to have. So thank you, and please thank our panellists.